Wonderful. Okay, so this morning I created kind of like a two-piece handout. The first 2 pages are the 4 different stories of Jesus's anointing in the Gospels. So this happens, this particular story is likened to the stories that I put here that we see in Matthew chapter 26, Mark chapter 14, Luke chapter 7, and John chapter 12. In Matthew and Mark, they are incredibly similar to each other, almost exact. John has, and in Luke, almost completely different to the stories, but we'll touch upon that in a little bit, their similarities. And then John version has some elements of Matthew, Mark, and then a little bit, just like a connection or two on Luke. So that the first piece of the handout is kind of like what I did last time. It notes those similarities between the stories. But then the second piece of the handout, titled Setting the Scene, shows that each of these stories is set up the same, or the elements that they have in each story are parallel to one another, even though they're not exactly the same story. So Matthew, Mark, and John version all occur towards the end of Jesus's ministry as we get towards in the Passion narrative. And then Luke's version occurs closer to the beginning, almost a little bit after Jesus's ministry starts. Jesus's ministry starts, I think, in Luke chapter 4 or 5. And then shortly after this happens, we get this story here in Luke chapter 7. So then I want to go through the setting the scene section, so we can look at each part of the story, and not just the differences, but see how they're all structured. Matthew and Mark, this is the only time Jesus is anointed, or that we hear about Jesus being anointed. I didn't double check on Luke, but I know in John, this is the first time that Jesus is anointed, and then he will be anointed in John chapter 19, after he has already passed and his body is being prepared for burial, to be buried. So let's set the scene and kind of see how each story that is used here has the same structure. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the setting. So if you go to setting the scene, the first thing that is highlighted in yellow is the setting, right? In Matthew here, you see that Jesus was in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. Same thing in Mark chapter 14. And then in Luke chapter 7, it says, one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. He went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. Matthew and Mark also note the table. And in John chapter 12, it says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. And Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table. So Matthew and Mark, in the preceding chapters, it says that, so that's the setting. And then timing. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, Matthew, Mark, and John are towards the end of Jesus' ministry as he's going towards his eventual death. So Matthew and Mark happen to be 2 days before Passover. Obviously, Luke's timing is weeks before Passover. And then John is 6 days before Passover, right? Is there anything you have questions on or noting or wondering about as we begin starting to set the scene here?
Just one thing. When were these, and this is a tough question, I'm not sure anybody knows for sure, but what's the difference in years that these things were actually written?
Oh, John, you're gonna make me remember this morning. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to phone a friend, Julie, because I can't remember this moment, any of the timing.
So Mark's the earliest, probably around 70 AD. And then Matthew and Luke, probably maybe 90.
Yeah, yeah.
And then
I don't know about John though.
John's even further.
John is, yeah, so, but Mark is the earliest, and then you have Matthew and Luke, and then John a little later. So that's why you see, right, Matthew is pretty much a copy of Mark's story. And then each Luke and John, John has those elements of the Matthew, Mark, and the Luke. And then Luke is kind of just doing his own thing now. The author of this particular version of Jesus's anointing, it's just kind of doing their own thing with their own purpose of their story, right, of their book.
So basically they were written 70 years to 80 years beyond the time that the events actually occurred, almost a century.
No, it's more like 40.
It's like 40, right?
40.
So if
Okay,
Jesus
I-
died in 33 AD,
Yeah.
then Mark was written around
40 years,
70.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay, it's certainly a lifetime or a couple of generations. So
At
I
least I
can-
would say one generation for sure in that
Yeah.
earlier one, right? But then, yeah, after that, it gets into 2 and 3. So something of note is, I thought I had it here, yeah. So Bethany is where I think Lazarus and Mary and Martha live, and it's also where he was raised from the dead. So that story happens in Bethany. So Lazarus is noted in John 12, and before this specific story in John, they're plotting to kill Lazarus. So again, all of that combined is alluding to Jesus's eventual death as well. So all these stories are pointing towards something, are pointing towards Jesus's eventual death, right? I'm sorry, in John, it's not just Lazarus, I think it's also Jesus, who is threatened, and so then he retreats to Bethany. So Bethany is a place of kind of retreat. He's running away from potential death because it's not time yet. But again, when the story happens, it's alluding to that time when he will eventually die, right? And again, it's the place where Lazarus did die and then was resurrected. So pretty important. Yes, Cheryl.
Oops. You said they were plotting to kill Lazarus. Why? Because his raising from the dead was such a remarkable sign, or what was going on about that?
Let me double check. I thought I had it in my notes here, but I don't. Let me see. Oh, okay, that makes more sense. I misspoke, sorry. So it was just to, thank you. It was just to, the plot to kill Jesus because of Lazarus raising from the dead. Yeah. So they're like, who is this person raising people from the dead? So that's when Jesus retreats to Bethany, back to the place where it happened, and again, alluding to what just happened in the preceding chapter. John 11 is the story of Lazarus dying, being resurrected, and then them being the religious leaders being upset at this occurrence from Jesus. Sorry, I misspoke there.
No, I think there is a plot against Lazarus.
Is there a plot against Lazarus?
Yeah.
What does it say?
I'm just
Taking a look. Okay, we'll come back to it. I'm sorry, Cheryl, for not having that information. But I think you're right. What you said is, again, he's a follower of Jesus, very close to Jesus, and then comes back, to life. All right, and then we move on to, in Matthew and Mark, it just says a woman came. So this woman is nameless. There's no identity. We don't know, if she lives there, if she was following Jesus.
It's right after this section,
Oh, it's after
actually.
this section,
It's not
okay.
in John 11.
Okay,
So it's chapter 12, verse 10. So the chief priest planned to put Lazarus to death as well as Jesus.
okay. So I'm assuming again.
Since it was on account of him that many of the Jews were deserting and believing in Jesus.
There you go. Thank you, Julie. I was like, I'm pretty sure I read that, but I guess I was wrong. Nope, I was right. So in Matthew and Mark, this woman is nameless. Again, we have no idea what's going on. She comes out of nowhere, but we can assume that maybe this dinner or this, there may be a party going on at Simon's house. So it's pretty customary for people, to be coming in and out of situations like that. And it's really interesting, right? So it says Simon the leper in Matthew and Mark, and it may not mean that Simon necessarily had leprosy, but he had some type of illness. But nonetheless, noting that he was a leper meant that he was unclean, right? So Jesus is again hanging out with people that the religious leaders are upset about. In the previous chapters of him sitting and eating with sinners and outcasts and people you're not supposed to properly sit and eat with, right? And then this woman comes out of nowhere. In Luke chapter 7, it says a woman in that town who lived a sinful life. So again, a Pharisee, is having this party. Again, people may have been coming in and out. So this woman knows that Jesus is there. And it notes this particular, a sinful life right before this, like in the chapter. Again, Jesus is eating, the Pharisees are specifically critiquing Jesus for eating with sinners, right? But then still invite him over for dinner. So it seems kind of weird that they're criticizing him for eating with unclean people or people that aren't, but then decided to invite him for dinner.
Keep gathering evidence.
Excuse me?
Gathering evidence.
Oh, gathering evidence. Right, I was about to say there's no specific reason, right? They say that they invited him, but that's one reason, that they could is gathering evidence. What's another reason why, you think that they invited Jesus over?
Show him off.
Show
Jesus
him
is
off.
my friend. Look
Yeah,
at that.
That's good. Dinners like this were also places where discourse happened, right? So maybe not just gathering evidence, but to fight Jesus, to have a little word with him, to not to show him off, sorry, to kind of, what's the phrase I'm thinking of?
Show him up.
To show him up, to make him look bad, right? So this, maybe this discourse starts happening, and the Pharisee who knows the law really, really well wants to out show off Jesus in this setting. There's a variety of reasons why, but Jesus doesn't care who is invited him to dinner. He still goes, right? And I'm pretty sure he knows all of those things could possibly happen, and he still shows up. And there is a little bit of controversy on this woman, specifically in Luke, right? So many people think that this woman is a prostitute. Many people think that she's Mary Magdalene because of the description of a sinful life, right? But this term or this phrase, sinful life, may just have been a person who doesn't follow the Jewish law or the Jewish morals in the way that the Pharisees or religious leaders thought she should. It's not even that she necessarily did anything wrong, but according to the people in that town, they saw her as sinful. They put her on the outside, on the outskirts, on the outside, because of their personal ideas and beliefs, right? She may be a really great person, but because of people's perceptions of her, because of rumors, because of whatever else, she is seen as a simple woman with a simple life, right? So
happens today.
right,
It
yeah,
does.
yeah,
When you're doing anything wrong, if somebody gets that perception of you, there goes your rep. I don't really care about, but that's,
yeah. Yeah, no, that's a big deal, right? I mean, especially back then, if you're a woman, you don't really get a choice to choose what kind of reputation you have.
Yeah.
It's all
You should
predicated
be
on a man's
marriageable,
description.
you should be, clean.
Yeah.
All that stuff.
Yeah. And then in John's version, it's Mary. It's Mary who is the woman in the story. Who is obviously a close friend of Jesus, loves Jesus. And then the next part is the materials used in the story, and it's in the red lettering here. So Matthew, it's purple. Sorry. In Matthew, it's an alabaster jar of costly ointment. In Mark, it's costly ointment of nard. And Luke, it's an alabaster jar of perfumes. And in John, it's a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. In John, it's particularly interesting that it notes a pint of pure nard, which actually is about 12 ounces. It noted in some of the commentaries I read. But it's really extravagant and it's really expensive. Right, so that's the point of this, and it's the word used, I think, in Matthew and Mark, is not just like not just the ointment or the oil used for people are used to be buried in, right? It's not just like the regular. It's the word creo, not just the regular term for the preparation of somebody's burial. But it's the word myron, and it's showing extravagance, right? So and this is specifically for Jesus, right? This is extravagant thing being done for Jesus, who is for these women, right? Something important, something special, and something that they think needs to be done for Jesus before he goes to die and be eventually buried, right? So it's not just, I'm going to prepare a regular old, kind of burial
Do they
scene.
know that he's going to die?
So what do you think? If they're coming and doing this?
Well, I think they have an idea that he's probably going to die. I don't know if they know for sure.
Okay.
But I do think they have an idea that he's going to.
If you have an idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They wouldn't do this if they didn't think he was. I just don't think they would. They would use that expensive oil and perfume and everything if they didn't think he was going to die. I don't think they'd even be there. They might be because they adored him, but to do this, I don't know. In my humble opinion, I don't know.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's the story of the widow's mite, and it could just be that someone was giving everything she had to show her devotion and love and faithfulness.
Good possibility, yes.
Yeah.
That's all she had, and she had to give something to Jesus because she loved him. She thought if she was there with him, she'd have to give him something special.
Yeah.
And that's all she had. That was
Yeah.
special.
Yeah.
So that makes perfect sense too. Either one.
Yeah, so in Matthew and Mark, I know I mentioned that, at parties, people come and go, but it's not proper, right, for women and men to be communicating or to be, touching each other if they're not married. And especially not in the open like this, right? There must be other people, especially at the dinner party, right? The Pharisee, and at the dinner, and John, there are other people there. So in Matthew, Mark, and John, it may be that they're in a enclosed setting. So that there are people from the house, so it's not as controversial as what happens in Luke, right? This woman comes out of nowhere, risks, again, her reputation, but it just seems like it's not great already, so what does it matter?
Yeah.
But so she so again, very expensive, and so in John, this the amount is 100-fold after Jesus dies. So in John chapter 19, it says, I think the word is in another, I think the NIV and John is not a pint, but a litra of pure nard is used. And then in John chapter 19, it says a litra like 100 times that. So this is a small glimpse, a small taste of what will eventually happen, right? So we get how important this is, and then afterwards, it's just extravagance, right? It's just so much more after Jesus passes because of his ministry, right? They finally kind of get it, so then they're like, oh, we really gotta, provide Jesus with the best. And then what happens? In Matthew, she pours it on his head, and Mark, she pours it on his head. And Luke, she is, standing behind his feet, weeping, and she begins to wet his feet with her tears. And she wipes them with her hair and kisses his feet and pours perfume on them. And Mary pours the ointment on his feet and wipes it with her hair. And the house is filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Right? I like Mark's kind of addition. She broke open the jar. I imagine like this dramatic scene where, she probably has this jar and then like throws it on the ground. And at that point, I would assume, right, it also, if it smelled, it just filled the air, right? It's being broken. The jar, the vessel that it's in, it's no longer contained. I'm assuming it's kind of messy. And I mean, pouring, something on somebody's head also seems messy in general. Right? There's no good way of doing it unless she like put it in her hands and then rubbed it on him. But she doesn't do that. She just completely pours it on him. And then in Luke, so this is the aspects of John that kind of take from the Luke's version, right? This wiping with the hair, that had some sexual connotations to it. If you used your hair to touch somebody's feet, or like touching a man's feet had sexual connotations to it. So again, in Luke, it's the sinful woman, and she just keeps going, right? She just keeps going. She's touching a man's feet. She's, she's putting her hair down, which is not supposed to be down, and she's wiping his feet, and she's crying, and she's kissing his feet. There's just a lot of things going on. And in Mary, she does the same thing, but again, it may be that it's in a more intimate setting. It's more closed. Everybody there knows who Mary is to Jesus. But again, it's still really personal to have her hair down and to be using it to do something like this, right? I've never done this before. I don't know if any of you have, but I'm assuming like it's just really intimate to be touching somebody's feet, and to be something that matters to a lot of people, which is your hair, right? It's kind of a representation of who you are also doing this. So I think going back to what we were talking about, they thought this was important enough to do things like this that seemed kind of outrageous and kind of weird, right? There aren't many stories like this. There aren't, the drama of breaking it open, of having so much, of crying and wiping, right? This obviously matters to them enough to do
It's out of
something.
the ordinary, so Jesus would notice her.
Yeah.
And so Jesus would know this. She loved him enough to do something that just totally is against all the rules and off the wall, just a little bit weird, like you said.
Yeah.
And which this was. And they had washing of feet,
Yeah.
but not anointing of feet. So that was just totally out of the ordinary.
Yes, and there's something that you alluded to, we'll touch on a little bit later, that washing of the feet. So then we have some people who get all huffy and puffy about the situation, which I understand. Again, it's really weird. I bet it's really weird to watch this scene unfold. So there's a couple of different people, right? And not this is I think the most different of each of the stories, of who gets upset at what is happening, right? So in Matthew, it says the disciples saw it, they were angry. And Mark, it says, but some were there who said to one another in anger. In Luke, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, said to himself. And then in John, it says, but one of his disciples, specifically Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Right? So what is going on here? Who's all huffy and puffy and objecting of the situation?
The bad guys.
Say it again, Kathy.
The bad guys.
Bad guys. Specifically, I'm gonna be a little bit more simple, right? Probably the men.
Men.
But not all the men. It specifically talks about the Pharisees and Judas.
Yes.
There are other men there, Jesus and the other apostles.
Yes.
That's Matthew though. Matthew and Mark, the disciples.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
it says, but some were there. We don't know. It's really nice
Oh,
for the
sorry.
disciples in
The
Mark.
blue is hard to read.
Right? Okay, sorry. And Mark, it just says some were there who said to one another. But in Luke, right, we'll get a little bit into, right? But so, and in John, it does this whole foil, right? This funniness, like Judas Iscariot, who we know is going to betray Jesus, is the one objecting. Ha, ha, ha. Right? It's kind of a joke in the situation. Right? And even the disciples, all of these people, presumably, even the some, even though we don't know who they are, have been with Jesus, have experienced Jesus, have probably heard Jesus talk about him going to die. I've probably heard him say, I will not always be here, so get ready. And they still do not get it. But who does in this story? Who gets what's going on?
The women.
Whoever this woman is, or Mary, as the case may be.
Exactly. And I bet the men feel especially foolish about that. Because they see what the scene is going on. Not only is it like outrageous and weird, but they're obviously missing something. They obviously don't understand what's going on. If Jesus isn't shooing this woman away, if Jesus is accepting what is going on, right? They're upset that they don't get what's going on. Right? It doesn't make any sense to them, so it must be wrong. Right? How often do we do that to each other and to other people? We don't know the situation. We don't know the scenario. We just make assumptions
So many times.
and we condemn people for it.
And
Right?
it's real fast, if you're on the end where everybody is, or someone.
Yeah.
Is saying that's something that just is not so. And it
Yeah.
drives me nuts. I've been going through that recently. It's the friend of mine that absolutely makes me nuts.
And we're all the main characters, right? We're all the women in this story. Of course, we know what's going on. Of course, we would anoint Jesus, in front of all these people. But that's not always true. We don't always get it.
No.
We might easily say, we should be giving that money to the poor instead of using ointments.
Yes. it's really interesting, right? So then they say, yes, why waste this? In Matthew, Mark, and John, it's all the same. Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For the ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and the money given to the poor. Mark uses specifically, it has a number, but John also says worth a year's wages. So obviously a lot of money for this ointment, for what has been used. And then again, yeah, with this kind of indignant righteousness, why wasn't it sold, to help the poor? Why wasn't it used in a better way? Why wasn't it used the way that I think it should have been used?
Yeah.
The way that I perceive it to be used in my mind, because I don't know what's going on. So I'm gonna make a judgment or assessment on the situation without the full picture.
Jesus said,
And in John, it says about Judas, he didn't say this because he really cared about the poor, but because he was a thief and he was dipping into the money that should have gone to the poor himself.
Yeah. I love John really calling out Judas in this story, just laying it all out there. This is why. This is who he is. True picture, revealing himself, right? And yes, and then Jesus steps in. I love in Mark and Luke, it doesn't say that they tell Jesus specifically or that they say it out loud. And Mark, it says they say to one another in anger. And in Luke, the Pharisee says, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. So he says this to himself. He didn't tell anybody, doesn't say it out loud necessarily. He says it to himself. If Jesus was a prophet, and when Jesus responds, he knows exactly what he was thinking, proving he is a prophet. And the Pharisee doesn't know what he's talking about, right? But in each of these stories, Jesus responds, right? And Matthew and Mark, again, and in Matthew and Mark, he says, why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me, right?
Yeah.
So this,
he's taken up for, and that is just not done.
and so it's not just that she does something good, right, in like a general good sense. This good work or this good service is used specifically for an idea or the term of pious practices, which he doesn't say, oh, let me see. Yeah, it doesn't say in Luke. But you get that idea, right? That what she does is not just good, it's holy. It's set apart, it's different than what everybody else is doing. It's used for something more than meets the eye. Right? And she understands that by doing that. And again, it's just so funny that the people who have been so close to Jesus, the people who claim to know the law and be so great, are not getting it. They completely miss the mark here.
Right over their head. Like,
Yep.
what the heck is going on here?
Yep. And Luke, Luke is the most different, but later on in the story, Jesus says, this woman showed me all the hospitality in the world, and you invited me here and you showed me no hospitality. And hospitality was incredibly important in that time, right? Washing, when people came in, you gave them the opportunity to wash their feet, to wash their hands, to, anoint themselves with perfume, to do all these things, right? He says, Simon, he turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house and you did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Right? So he calls the Pharisee, who is later Jesus named as Simon the Pharisee. telling him, you think that you know what's better, you think you know what's right, but you didn't even do the bare minimum, the basic that was needed for you to do in showing hospitality to me. Right? So then again, it goes back to what were the motives in inviting Jesus to this table? Right? Why did they invite him there and not treat him like a proper guest? But then this woman, right, this Pharisee who's supposed to be pious, who's supposed to be an example, in contrast to the woman who is sinful, does all the correct things for Jesus when she enters and sees him, right? Yeah, and then he says this, I think very controversial, but wild phrase, for you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. Right? What does that make you think of? Or what is it, what thoughts come to mind when you hear that?
I think he's defending her actions because she's going to be one of the ones that anoint him when he's dead, and he knows that. Nobody else really does, but he does. Seems to know it anyway, and he wants to give her special attention, and nobody else was paying any attention to him or was doing what they were supposed to. She was right on like what she's supposed to do. She's supposed to make him welcome and show her love for him, and they weren't doing that. Yeah. They were just being buckheads. I mean, for lack of a better term, but they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing, and he's calling their attention to it. And I think she was very brave. That's all I think. Yeah, she's very brave.
Carol?
Well, we know that this is one of those, as you said, controversial scriptures that has been proof texted, to excuse greed or neglecting the needs of others. But actually, right within it, one of the things that it's saying that there are certain things that are ongoing, but that doesn't mean that we should not pay attention to the needs of the person in the here and now, is kind of what I read there. You can substitute all kinds of things for poor or the poor. I think that what he's saying that our main aim is our attention and our presence with the needs of who is here right now, whether that's right in front of us or in this current time or whatever.
In these passages, what you're dealing with is what was logical in the background, the rules of the time, and so forth. And Judas is talking, his idea makes sense. Why waste the perfume? But Jesus doesn't deal with logical. He deals with more emotional and what people are feeling. And it's kind of like, if you wanted to really play this game on it, it's kind of like what was going on in the judicial hearings. You had some people that were talking to the young lady that was going to, or actually not a young lady anymore, but the lady was going to be becoming a Supreme Court judge. And they were talking about some of the things she'd done in regards to her rulings. And they were very concerned about that. They had their reasons, of course, because they're opposed to her. And then you had the fellow from Senator from New Jersey He was talking about, what a nice job you have done over the years. He was thinking more in emotional terms. She was, or she is, a good person. And so I can see some analogies here where you're trying to use law and order as you see it for your argument, if there is an argument going on here. And the opposite is, no, this is emotional. These people are strongly for him, and therefore that's what this lady, this is how she's dealing with it. I don't know if that answers anything, but
I think it's such a good point that Jesus often turns conventional logic or the conventional common sense of the day on its head with his saying and his stories. It's a very good point.
I mean, before this, right, Jesus is often saying, care for the poor, care for the outcast, care for those in need and sick. And so they're thinking that you can't have either, right? So this story is, I think you're right. I think it's logical to ask this question if you don't know what's going on. I think it's logical to question this if you have no idea what's going on. But again, Jesus has made it perfectly clear that I will not always be here, right? So it's important that, of course, it's important that you help the poor always. But in this specific moment, there's also a place and a time to specifically prepare to worship, Jesus, right? So, and it's not that when you aren't specifically anointing Jesus, that you aren't somehow sharing the good news or living your life, right? As a Christ follower, right? It's not just only when this happens or this happens. They're not separate completely instances or ideas, right? So it's something that I thought was really interesting is in kind of Jewish law or practice, there was always a question of, do you helping the poor versus burying the dead? And this was a huge debate, because burying the dead takes time and it takes money, it takes effort. And again, they thought that burying the dead was more important since it can be done, it's only done within a certain time versus the constant priority of helping the poor. That's a constant that will be there. Jesus being there Jesus won't always be there. That's specifically unique. I just think it's interesting, that it's so controversial because I think it speaks again to the now and the not yet, right? It speaks to what's going on in this moment, the inbreaking of the preparation for what will come, the preparation for Jesus's eventual death and resurrection, but also of the reality of their circumstances, right? We know that the poor need help. We know that they do, and they will do after I leave. But after I leave, it'll be different, right? Or it's supposed to be different. It won't be how it's always been, right? Yes, helping the poor, but I've told you over and over again to help the poor. And I've told you over and over again that I won't always be here. So when I leave, take my example when helping the poor, right? So again, they think of it as a very much here and now, but Jesus is pointing and is talking about the future, talking about something that has not yet happened, but will, and will continue to happen, right? Luke's story is a little bit different. Jesus tells this parable of two people who owned, a moneylender money, and one owned 500 denarii and the other 50. Right, so two very drastic, very different sums, and both are forgiven. Right, and he says, which one will love more? And Simon replies, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. necessarily. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, even logically thinking about, you know, he owes the most, but he's not gonna necessarily be the one that's the most grateful.
Yeah.
The one that owes the least has the least, so he's gonna be really grateful that he doesn't have to pay that 50 back. And so he can take care of his family, do whatever he needs to do. The one that owes the most probably has more, has a lot more, and that 500, it'll be great if we're given, but it's not gonna make that big a deal for it. It's not gonna be as grateful as
But-
the
but
other one.
Jesus says you have judged correctly. I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven, and Jesus says you have judged correctly, which is interesting because it's not necessarily about the money, it's about the recognition
Yeah.
of what was done,
Exactly.
right? It's about recognizing forgiveness, right? So this woman has recognized forgiveness more often than Simon has, right? She sees it in Jesus. The moment she walks in, right? And does what and her response is what she does in Luke, right? The Pharisee sees Jesus and is just like, whatever you think of Jesus, Jesus still points to God, whether you think he's blaspheming or not, still points to God, right? And what is the response? You can choose to have a variety of responses. You can choose to acknowledge God in that still or not, right? It's not a perfect analogy. And again, there's different ideas about, this weird parable. And then at the end, Jesus, tells this woman her sins are forgiven. And then they're again like, who is this person forgiving sins? Right? And again, it's you can say it's about Jesus, but again, it can go back to the fact that who forgives sin, right? God forgives sin. And so how great is it that God continues to forgive? And the person who knows that most likely, right, the Pharisee doesn't acknowledge it as much as the woman who lives this life, quote unquote.
Another thought here too is that we wouldn't be reading this or paying much attention to this if it wasn't for the fact that Jesus didn't necessarily answer the way they expected him to answer. If he was a standard base of answering questions or was like many of the people at the time in the laws, how many Pharisees are we talking about here that had followed the law? This guy came with a new plan, a new idea, and his new idea is actually the one that stuck around because it's in the papers here. I think sometimes a person, I realize when you say controversial things, that it can go both ways. But for the most part, in this case, he said controversial things, but he says it with a lot of deep thought. Controversy for his time, with a lot of deep thought. And I think that's the reason that we are reading about Jesus today in the Bible today.
Thank you, John. I think something that is really interesting in reading this story specifically is the ending of Matthew and Mark, right? That I don't hear as often. Jesus says in Mark verse 13, truly I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. Right? So not necessarily this woman, but this story is supposed to be coupled with the good news. How often in the, I don't know, you hear the story, the road, the story of the good news, or all these ways that it's the good news is put together and formed. And how often do you hear this story coupled with it? Almost never,
Yeah. I
right?
was thinking, I don't think I ever remembered. This is first on. Well, I remember her crying on Jesus' feet and wiping his hair. That's about the only part of that I remember.
Yeah. I don't, when I first came to church, that's not a story that was told to me in joining, or a reason for joining, or the importance of joining, right? The story isn't told coupled with it, right? And why do you think that? Or what's a reason? I don't have an answer necessarily, either,
Because
but
she's a woman, I really don't know, I don't have an answer. Because women aren't supposed to be important, men are, and they take care of all the business, and they make the rules. And if she's coming along and breaking the rules, more than likely they're gonna put her kind of aside. I don't know. This is my humble opinion.
yeah,
I have no idea, really. Just a guess. I don't think anybody really knows. You might, Miss Julie, you have a thing about that?
Just kind of similar to what you're saying, that kind of men controlled these texts in the transmission of them.
Yeah.
And so just taking away from what the women did, I guess we'll leave the story in there.
I like that. Yeah, I like that.
And it's seldom that women are let into the text anyway, and seldom that they're ever even named when they are let in. I mean, it's not as if there aren't any women with names, but if, when they appear in the text at all, it's often very briefly and anonymously, so it's very easy for that to slip from people's attentions.
Most of the time it says the women or the woman, they don't.
Yeah.
Her name.
yeah. I mean, in this,
Like
in
she
Matthew,
would
Mark
have
says
a
a
name.
woman.
You know.
I think the story is, if you couple it with the good news, right, it's that it won't always seem good to those in power. It won't always seem good to those who think they know what's going on, right? Again, it seems logical to ask, why wasn't this used for the poor? But following Jesus isn't always logical, right? Doing what you think is necessary for the kingdom of God may not always be logical, right? You might sometimes look like the odd person out in doing what you think is necessary. And that's, and we're careful with that, obviously, because you can form any text or any idea to what you think. But again, it shows your piety. You think you're so good and you're so righteous all the time. Just be careful, because there's people among you who really get it. And you may be saying things about them and you may not understand, but sometimes they have the best example of what to do. Right? So yeah. That's all I got for today. Any other comments, questions?
You made us think, that's good.
Thank you, Tessa. Yes.
You think that.
All right. I think it's time.
I gotta go sing.
All right.